Good afternoon, and welcome to COVID Conversation. My name is Tim Caddigan. I am the chair of the board of the Oakville Chamber of Commerce. On today's episode, we are pleased to have the Chief Economist and Vice President of Policy from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Dr. Trevin Stratton. Dr. Stratton is an award-winning business economist specializing in global and technological change. With a decade of experience building alliances among businesses, academic institutions, trade associations, labor groups, and nonprofit organizations, Trevin has been instrumental in shaping the public policy environment in Canada and abroad. As chief economist at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, he helps develop national policy positions aimed at improving Canada's economic performance and the competitiveness of Canadian business. He's a regular contributor on BNN, CBC, and CTV. And we're pleased to have Trevin join us on COVID Conversation from his office in Ottawa. Good afternoon, Trevin.
Afternoon, Tim.
The Canadian Chamber of Commerce worked with StatsCan to produce a major survey on business conditions amid the pandemic. It's an incredible sample size of close to 13,000, which yielded many insights. Now, my major takeaway, and the theme I'd like to explore further, is how business can come out of the crisis intact and the challenges that some businesses will face in doing so. Trevin, you are quoted as saying that the survey will give us a view into how our businesses are adapting, managing, or sadly failing as the COVID-19 shutdown continues. One of the striking numbers that came out of the survey concerns the cash buffer that businesses had going into COVID-19. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this was a concern for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce from the start. At the beginning of the crisis, we had some data even before our own survey with Statistics Canada that came out from JP Morgan in the United States, that the average small business in the US had about 27 days of cash buffer on hand, when the crisis started. And so this is one of the reasons why we pushed so strongly for liquidity measures at the beginning of the crisis. Things like the wage subsidy, the emergency business account that were created. When our survey came out, it certainly demonstrated that this concern was in fact there for a good reason. When we asked businesses how much of a cash buffer they had going into COVID-19, going into the crisis, about 42% of them said that they couldn't operate longer than 60 days without a source of revenue. Over half of them, 50%, said that they couldn't operate longer than 90 days without a source of revenue. Obviously, we're around 8 weeks into the crisis right now, and so it really speaks to how crucial the coming weeks will be for a number of small businesses across the country, and that they're really hitting up against those liquidity constraints. But we also asked them a number of other questions as well. We asked them the extent to which they have experienced a decrease in demand during this period as well. And it was shocking, 81% of businesses said that they experienced a medium to high drop in demand for their services and products, which really speaks to the pain that a lot of businesses are feeling. And similarly, we asked businesses, how much has your revenue declined? So we asked for a comparison between the first quarter of this year versus the first quarter of 2019. And over half of businesses said that their revenue declined over 20%. About 54% of businesses said their revenue had declined over 20%. So that's, this certainly speaks to the liquidity challenges a lot of businesses are facing right now and the cash crunch that they're feeling.
So, we're witnessing now across the country as premiers plan how to approach reopening the economy. And I think the only consistent part of those plans might be that physical distancing may still be a thing in the months ahead. How does maintaining physical distancing play into the survival of these businesses that you surveyed?
Yeah, so we actually had some data on that too. We asked businesses how long they can remain partially or fully open amid social distancing measures. And about 17% of them said they could remain open for no time at all. And so this, if we're thinking about businesses that might have challenges coming out of this crisis, there are a good amount of them. And hopefully some of the measures that have been put in place will help them with that. But another around 22% said that they could remain open for no longer than 3 months. amid social distancing. And so we're also approaching that point too. And so it's something that businesses are grappling with every day right now. When it comes time to provinces and territories cautiously reopening businesses across Canada, obviously the safety of workers and consumers is going to have to be paramount as well. And it's for that reason that we've provided recommendations to Health Canada in coordination with provincial and territorial health officers as well, to develop things like updated guidelines for employers, on the proper use of personal protective equipment of PPE, and other health and safety considerations that are going to be related to combating COVID-19. For many employers and employees, this pandemic was really their first experience using PPE, and meeting stricter health and safety standards. And so in the rush to acquire and distribute PPE, many businesses may not have had the time or knowledge to appropriately educate their employees or the best practices for use. So that's why we're asking the federal government, as businesses prepare for the reopening of the economy, and as it's already started in many provinces, developing education and awareness materials for both employers and the general public. For example, what is appropriate personal protective equipment and how to use it? What are appropriate physical distancing best practices? What are suitable sanitation standards? Things like that. But we're also encouraging provincial and territorial harmonization for future health and safety expectations to simplify compliance for those firms that operate across the country as well. Certainly, these issues are provincial and territorial jurisdiction in many ways, but having national coordination for it is going to be very useful for businesses that operate across the country.
I've been very impressed throughout how the provincial and federal governments have worked cooperatively, and I think the whole Team Canada approach has been really quite impressive. But you at the Canadian Chamber have been quite involved really at the outset. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the work you've done, especially with the feds, in rolling out some of the programs that we're seeing here today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, at the beginning of the crisis, first of all, I want to give full credit to our CEO, Perrin Beatty, who, amongst the many cabinet hats that he used to wear, he also used to be the federal health minister as well. And so he really prepared the Canadian Chamber and rallied the troops in the Canadian business community to prepare for this pandemic very early on. And it's because of that we were able to feed in recommendations so quickly to the federal government when it came to a lot of the measures that were announced as well. And so, as I mentioned, we knew from the start, particularly that small businesses were going to be on the front lines of this crisis. And we knew the liquidity challenges that they were specifically going to be facing. And so we worked together with the federal government in terms of being able to provide things like the lending that's going out through BDC and EDC, things like the emergency business account. But also, something that's very important and that has been a very big support for business is the wage subsidy itself. And this was important for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, payroll is one of the highest costs for a number of small businesses across the country. And so having support for that was going to be instrumental in addressing their liquidity concerns. But also, secondly, is maintaining that connection between employers and employees too. When the economy does start to open back up in phases, and we're going to need to be able to tap into that labor force, and maintaining those connections is going to be very useful when it comes to the speed of being able to get our labor force back to work as well. And so, we've been very closely involved with the federal government through the provincial and territorial chambers, with provincial governments, and through local chambers of commerce with municipal governments as well, in pushing forward what business needs during this time, and also feeding them information about what businesses are actually experiencing on the ground, what might be some of the issues with some of the measures as they were announced, so that the government can work together with the business community in addressing those and making sure that the businesses aren't falling through the cracks.
I feel like the whole process has been measured and consultative of many parties, and the Chamber network obviously part of that. One of the issues, I guess, that hit us pretty hard last week was the level of unemployment, and we've seen 40% of businesses responding that they've laid off staff. And businesses also changed a lot, and I got the sense that this won't necessarily be completely temporary. Can you talk to us a little bit about how business and the labor market will need to adapt in the months and years ahead?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. I agree with you. Like this will not be or some aspects of the crisis that we're experiencing will not be temporary. They'll be longer term trends. What we've seen actually is that a number of businesses have already started to adapt, or at least the businesses that can have started to adapt as well. So some of the findings from the survey that we did in partnership with Statistics Canada demonstrated that a number of businesses have altered their methods of production. About 35% of businesses have altered the products or services that they're offering. A very large amount of businesses are using new methods to interact with customers. A number of businesses are testing working from home. A number of businesses are testing e-commerce as well, new staff training methods. And so, many businesses are proving resilient in adapting to the crisis by making these changes as well. But definitely something that we're going to have to keep in mind is things are changing. The economy is changing in a number of different ways. First of all, I think maybe one of the most important is definitely how our labor force is changing. We have gone from one of the tightest labor markets in Canadian history, and in the span of 6 weeks to 3 million job losses and many more with reduced hours. And so, getting these Canadians back to work when it comes time for recovery and when it comes time for rebuilding and a longer term economic recovery plan, this is going to be very important. And reskilling and upskilling initiatives are going to be very important. The use of e-learning is going to be very important as well. And also getting actual granular, local labor market information in individual communities and what skills are needed and what jobs are available in those communities is going to be very important going forward too. But the economy is changing in a number of different ways as well. If we look internationally, the global economy is going to be very different too. Canada has often had a very international mindset when it came to the economy. We're a nation of traders, and exports have always been very important, particularly for certain industries. And we are looking at a world where the global economy might be more fragmented going forward than we've been used to for many decades previously. And so this is going to impact things like supply chains on being able to get individuals to Canada to provide the skills that we need. It's going to impact our ability to export. It's going to impact our ability to get international students at universities and colleges here as well. And so there are a lot of changes taking place. And when we come time for economic recovery and an economic recovery plan, we're going to need to put in place some policies that help businesses adapt to these changes, or at least for the trends that are longer term.
As an economist, you analyze and you project. What's the prognosis? Can we get back to that labor market that you described prior to the pandemic?
So, when I'm looking at the numbers, and I always provide the caveat that all the economic projections right now are very uncertain. This is very much a once in a century type of economic downturn and pandemic. But also that a lot of the numbers or projections are going to depend on what policy measures are put in place, on how consumers adapt, on how safe people feel out in public going forward. And so there are a lot of question marks when it comes to economic projections. But at least with the numbers that we do have, looking backwards at least, for the month of March, and even the crisis, the true economic impact of the crisis was really only for half of March in a lot of ways. The Statistics Canada did a flash projection that our economy, our GDP, declined 9% during the 1 month of March. Looking forward, or looking at the period that we're currently in right now, so for the second quarter of this year, from April to June, the Bank of Canada is projecting somewhere between a 15 to 30% decline in GDP, quarter over quarter from the fourth quarter of 2019. And so that's obviously a significant decline. And the quarter that we're now in is really supposed to be the worst of the crisis, economically speaking. Though once again, we don't know how things are going to transpire going forward. Looking forward for the whole year of 2020, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is projecting a decline of around 6.2% in Canada's GDP annually from 2019 last year, which is a huge decline. But then projections expect a rebound in 2021 both for Canada. Canada's growth rate in 2021 is projected to be over 4%, and globally as well. And so, if these projections are correct, once again, a lot is still unknown. We're not really looking at a rebound until at least 2021. But also keeping in mind, will we be going back to what the labor force used to be, or what the economy used to be? We're declining 6.2% this year, and we may be growing 4% or a bit over 4% in 2021. That still doesn't make up the difference from what we lost. And so we're very much looking at a longer time period for full economic recovery.
Dr. Janet Morrison of Sheridan, the president of Sheridan, will join us next week, and we'll spend some time talking about that reskilling aspect. Is it futile to look for any markers in history to compare this to? I read something, and it was probably simplified to a non-economist like me, that looked at the Spanish flu and how, that pandemic had many similarities, and yet we came out of it and ended up with the roaring 20s. Is that just too far gone that we can do any comparison at all?
Well, certainly medical technology, the pharmaceuticals that we're able to provide with people for battling the virus is very different now than it was in 1919. I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm an economist. And so I look at different downturns. And in particular, when it comes to things like reopening the economy as well, we trust that the public health experts will be providing us with the best advice on when to do that. And it's not necessarily up to the economists like me to do that either. But when I look at different financial crises, and I am an absolute student of financial history, my academic research was on the Great Depression itself. And so I've looked at a number of crises throughout history. And this one is unique from at least what we're used to when we see economic downturns and economic crises. If we look at the one that's freshest in our memory in 2008, this was a very different type of downturn. In 2008, we saw a number of asset bubbles. We saw a number of fault lines in the financial sector and in the economy as a whole that led to a crisis itself. This economic downturn wasn't necessarily because of underlying fault lines in the economy. It wasn't because of an asset bubble in stock markets. Not to say that those may have not existed. Obviously, we had 10 years of growth and a bull market on the stock market. And a number of people were asking when the business cycle would end and that there would be a decline. But that in itself did not cause the crisis. The crisis was caused by an external event, being a pandemic, right? That was the catalyst for the economic impacts that we're going to be experiencing for a much longer time. And so it's very different in that way. And so a lot of economists, a lot of central bank governors have more likened it to something like a natural disaster, or something like 9/11, where it changed certain supply chains. It caused some people to stay home. It decreased demand in a way because people might have not felt safe in public spaces, things like that, but to a much greater extent. So there are parallels that we can look at throughout history, but it's very different than the event that's freshest in our minds when it comes to a downturn being the 2008 crisis, or something as big as the Great Depression. This is a very different type of crisis than that. But the reverberations throughout the economy when it comes to demand and supply are similar, even though the catalyst itself was different.
If you've just joined us, you're watching COVID Conversation, a presentation of the Oakville Chamber of Commerce. And our guest today is Dr. Trevin Stratton, the Chief Economist and Vice President of Policy with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Trevin, some very smart people have said that shutting the economy down was the easy part compared to how challenging it will be to start it back up. And you just mentioned that a moment ago, so I want to dive into that a little bit. One key aspect of that notion is around the supply chain, as you said, and it has been completely disrupted. How will the supply chain be restored to meet the demand of an economy that is starting back up?
Yeah, and so we were definitely able to shut down the economy much more quickly than we're going to be able to start it back up. It's not like flipping a switch, though I wouldn't say it was easy to shut down the economy either. It was a challenge in and of itself as well. But when it comes to reopening and when it comes to supply chains, there are a lot of factors that we're going to need to keep in mind. First of all, that there are different within Canada, there are different reopening plans between different provinces and territories, and for good reason. There are different curves in each province and territory as well, and different data coming out. They're both, they're all experiencing different situations. But when it comes to businesses that operate across provinces, having those supply chains back up and running is going to be a challenge when you're dealing with a number of different jurisdictions. And so having a national conversation, having national guidelines, having national coordination is going to be very important when it comes to turning the economy back on, specifically for businesses going forward, because we're seeing a lot of supply chain disruption in certain sectors in particular. But it is very big, and this creates what economists call dead weight loss, or it creates inefficiencies in the economy. A lot of what we've been seeing with economic integration and connectivity over the past few decades has really made our supply chains much more efficient. And one of the questions going forward will be, how do we ensure that that we return back to that is going to be an important priority for us too. But also when it comes to supply chains, getting access to personal protective equipment is going to be a very important aspect of this too. Certainly PPE has been and definitely should have been focused on frontline health workers, during the crisis. Now that economies are starting to reopen, we're also going to need to figure out how to get that PPE to businesses as well, and to their customers and consumers too, for people to feel safe in these spaces and for businesses to be able to remain in operation. And so this is going to be an important question too. What's going to be the supply chain in order for us to be able to access personal protective equipment for Canadians and for businesses too.
As you can imagine, our audience today is made up of business owners of all sizes. Many small and medium-sized businesses have never contemplated business resilience, at least not to the extent that larger industry does. What's the Chamber doing around making that a part of the conversation with the SME space?
Yeah, and we're definitely looking at this, and this is going to be an important aspect of our own recovery plan, our own roadmap to recovery. We have a number of different policy areas that we're looking at, and keeping in mind the ways in which COVID-19 has changed the world and changed the economy. And one of them is specifically related to small businesses. When it came to coming into this crisis, a lot of small businesses, many did, but a lot of them also did not have business continuity plans in place. We are hearing from thousands of small businesses during this period about what they need, the questions that they have about legal issues, about human resource issues with people working from home, about accounting and tax issues with some of the programs that have been available. And so we are working together with governments and other stakeholders in gathering the best information possible and toolkits for small businesses to be able to have these types of plans and information in place in the event that there is another pandemic or any other type of emergency, a natural disaster, a cybersecurity attack, and particularly on that last point, with the amount of use of e-commerce that we're seeing, with the use of working from home, also having those cybersecurity plans in place for small businesses in particular is going to be very important going forward.
We only have a few minutes left, but I did want to get into some of the work you've done with the federal government and your creation of the Canadian Business Resilience Network. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And so, there is certainly an acknowledgement that there is a lot of value in bringing together the entire Canadian business community during this crisis. As a form of communication itself, for businesses to be able to speak to one another, for sectors to be able to speak to one another, but also for a conversation between business and government. As I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, in terms of our relationship with the government, we have been providing them with the best information we can about what businesses are experiencing on the ground, but also vice versa. That there's a lot of information coming from government that businesses want to hear about too, and being able to have a one-stop shop, central hub of information for the Canadian business community in dealing and managing with the crisis. So we created the Canada Business Resiliency Network. If you go to cbrn.ca, you can find it there, with a lot of information and toolkits for businesses, with information about reopening, with information about economic recovery. And that's actually an engagement tool where we're looking to hear from businesses about what they think needs to be involved in longer term economic recovery going forward. And so we brought together the entire Canadian business community community. Over 100 different industry associations are involved from various different sectors, national business associations that represent the largest companies, national business associations that represent small businesses, and also our 450 local, provincial, territorial chambers of commerce as well. And so, it's really the entire business community coming together and working together to persevere and to prosper going forward.
Trevin, we pretty much have to leave it there. I think this conversation could have gone on for another half hour easy. I want to take some time to thank you for the work that you've done and all that the Chamber really has done in support of businesses across the country. So thanks for your time today.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tim. And thank you to the Oakville Chamber's efforts in helping businesses as well.
Thanks very much. Dr. Trevin Stratton is the Chief Economist and Vice President of Policy at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He joined us today on COVID Conversation from Ottawa. Our next COVID conversation will take place next week, May 13th at noon, and I'll be joined by Dr. Janet Morrison, the President and Vice Chancellor at Sheridan College. Colleges and universities will face both challenges and opportunities in the post-COVID world and will be instrumental in reskilling and preparing business for the future. Thanks for tuning in today on Facebook Live, Zoom, and Your TV. We hope you're finding this series helpful and informative. Have a productive and safe day.